Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Stolen Generations is a tragic and absolutely shameful chapter in the history of Australia, one that has left deep, lasting scars on Indigenous communities. Today is an important day to reflect on these policies of our country and the impact that they've had on First Nations Australians. The apology to the Stolen Generations was 17 years ago today, when the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, apologised to those stolen from their families. Today is a reminder of the deep injustices that have been done to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and an urgent call for action. It is a reminder that the legacy of those policies continue to shape the lives of First Nations people in Australia today. We continue to listen to those stories, and we know that the hurt will never go away. Children separated from their parents, forced to live in institutions or foster homes where they were stripped of their languages, traditions and identities. Most wicked breaking of the most sacred bonds between parents and children and families. Many were then subjected to physical, emotional and sexual abuse and faced ongoing neglect. For many, this loss of connection with family, culture and country has had intergenerational impacts, affecting not only those directly involved but also future generations. The pain caused by the removal of children has reverberated throughout communities, creating a cycle of loss that continues today. And this morning I was privileged to attend the Stolen Generations breakfast here in the Parliament and to hear from Stolen Generations survivors of the impacts that this has had on them. And it is incredibly generous, beyond words, that these people are willing to come into this place and to share those stories, and that they do so to see us move forward, to see us address the hurt that was caused, and to continue to move forward in reconciliation and in closing the gap. Listening to their voices and providing opportunities for them to share their stories is an important step in that healing process. It is through these stories that the full extent of the trauma can be understood. And I'm proud that our government will always continue to listen to First Nations Australians. Obviously, in 2023, we held a referendum and we didn't get the result that we wanted or that the majority of First Nations Australians wanted. But the Prime Minister this morning, who addressed the Stolen Generations breakfast, and he said that he will always be there as long as he was Prime Minister because it is such an important event. He talked about the referendum and he did say that, obviously, while it was not the result that we wanted and that has caused harm to many in the community, that he doesn't regret wanting to enlarge our nation, because that's why we're here. And as he said, we will get there. The arc of history bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King said. And so in that, while obviously that proposal for the voice to Parliament was rejected by the Australian people, and we respect that finding, that result, we are a government that will always listen to First Nations people and look to them for the ways in which we will close the gap and walk together in reconciliation. And an important part of that is, earlier this week on Monday, we have the Closing the Gap statement and the report. And since the apology, this has been an important process of looking at these terrible gaps that continue between First Nations and other Australians. And there is always more work to be done. But this is front of mind for our government and always will be front of mind for the Labor Party. One of the particularly regrettable, terrible parts of the gap is the high rates of out-of-home care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that currently exist and continue. And here in the ACT, we actually have some of those highest rates. And this is something that we must address, because this continues the trauma for those families and the breaking down of connections between families, communities, country and culture. And it's something we need to do better to address. And this is why we set up a First Nations Children's Commissioner, a first in this country, because we want to make sure that that Commissioner is watching out for our children, for the First Nations children around Australia. We are working with peak bodies through the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. This is a landmark partnership with First Nations groups across Australia. And earlier this week, the government released the Commonwealth's 2024 Closing the Gap Annual Report and 2025 Implementation Plan. And it outlines the actions that the Albanese government has taken over the past year to deliver on the outcomes of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. And it's focused on creating jobs and economic empowerment for remote communities, easing housing overcrowding and improving safety. The 2025 Implementation Plan outlines our strategy for the year ahead, focusing on easing cost of living pressures and improving food security in remote communities, delivering the next steps of our economic empowerment agenda and continuing to improve outcomes for First Nations people. And we will invest in a range of new measures, extending the Territory's Stolen Generations Redress Scheme for an additional 2 years to support Stolen Generations survivors. This is an incredibly important measure, and particularly for my community as part of the ACT. We are improving the health of First Nations people through regional and remote Australia through improving food security across those regions, including reducing the costs of 30 essential products in more than 76 remote stores to help ease cost of living pressures and improve access to quality food for people in remote communities. We will build a nutrition workforce in remote communities by upskilling up to 120 local First Nations staff in remote stores. We will roll out new laundries or upgrade existing facilities in 12 remote First Nations communities to help improve long-term health outcomes. We will strengthen the Indigenous procurement policy to boost opportunities for First Nations businesses to grow and create jobs. We will boost the Indigenous Business Australia's Home Loan Capital Fund and establish a place-based business coaching and mentoring program for First Nations businesswomen and entrepreneurs. We will increase the availability of culturally safe and qualified mental health support, including scholarships for up to 150 First Nations psychology students. We'll continue to deliver critical prevention, early intervention and response services to address family, domestic and sexual violence in high-need First Nations communities. And we will continue digitisation of at-risk audio and video collections held by First Nations broadcasters and community organisations by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Minister for Indigenous Australians Senator McCarthy has been working on food security throughout her career. She is committed to ensuring that remote Indigenous communities have regular and quality access to food, and she is making sure that Indigenous communities do not pay these high prices. And I just want to commend Senator McCarthy on the work that she is doing for closing the gap. And in my first term as the secretary of our committee, Caucus Committee on First Nations, our First Nations Caucus Committee, I had a privilege to work closely with her and also with the member for Barton, Linda Burney, and with Senator Pat Dodson on many of the issues, on really bringing to the forefront of our considerations the impacts on First Nations communities, and it's such a privilege to work with those leaders. And I guess I just take this opportunity to, on what may be the last day of Parliament, to acknowledge the member for Barton, Linda Burney, as the and former Minister for Indigenous Australians, for the incredible contribution she has made over many years. I believe one of the greatest leaders our country will see. And when I think of Linda, the word that comes to mind is grace. Grace and strength that she showed in an almost unfathomable way when confronted with some of the ugliest parts of Australian politics. And I thank her for her contribution, and we will miss her in this place, but I know that she will continue to contribute. And today, on this day, as we reflect on that anniversary and on the apology, may we always continue to listen to First Nations Australians and work together for a country that is truly one and truly is enlarged.